The morning fog hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla made her way through the ancient corridors, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. The weight of recent events pressed down on her shoulders like a crown she never wanted to wear. In her private chambers, she clutched a letter that had arrived just hours earlier, its contents threatening to shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. The letter bore the seal of her son Tom Parker Bowles, but the words written inside were unlike anything she had ever received from him before. Gone was the respectful tone she had grown accustomed to over the years. Instead, the pages were filled with demands that made her blood run cold. Tom was no longer content to remain in the shadows of royal life. He wanted recognition, titles, and, most shocking of all, a formal place in the line of succession. Camilla's hands trembled as she read the letter for the third time that morning. Tom had laid out his case with the precision of a lawyer and the determination of a man who felt he had been denied his birthright for far too long. He argued that as the son of the queen consort, he deserved more than the occasional invitation to state dinners or charity events. He wanted what he called his rightful position within the royal hierarchy. The timing of Tom's demands could not have been worse. The royal family was already dealing with various challenges, from public scrutiny over their finances to ongoing debates about the monarchy's role in modern Britain. The last thing they needed was an internal family dispute that could spiral into a constitutional crisis. Camilla knew she had to handle this situation delicately. Tom was her son, and despite his current demands, she loved him deeply. But she also understood the delicate balance that kept the monarchy stable. The rules of succession had been established for centuries, and changing them would require not just royal approval, but parliamentary consent and potentially even constitutional amendments. As she sat in her ornate sitting room, surrounded by portraits of previous queens and kings, Camilla reflected on how she had arrived at this moment. Her journey to the throne had been long and often painful. The public had not always accepted her, especially in the early years after Princess Diana's death. She had worked tirelessly to win over the British people, dedicating herself to charitable causes and supporting King Charles through his reign. Now, her son's demands threatened to undo years of careful relationship building with both the public and the royal family. She could already imagine the headlines if news of Tom's letter leaked to the press. The tabloids would have a field day, dissecting every word and analyzing every implication. The monarchy's carefully maintained image of stability and tradition would be called into question once again. Camilla's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her private secretary. Prince William wanted to see her immediately. Her heart sank as she realized that news of Tom's demands had already reached other members of the royal family. William, as heir to the throne, would naturally be concerned about any potential disruption to the established order. The walk to William's office felt longer than usual. Camilla passed through halls lined with centuries of royal history, each portrait and artifact a reminder of the weight of tradition she now carried. The monarchy had survived civil wars, world wars, and countless personal scandals. But each crisis had left its mark, and she wondered what mark this latest challenge would leave. William was waiting for her in his private study, his expression serious and unreadable. At 31, he had already shown remarkable maturity in his royal duties, but Camilla could see the stress of recent events in the lines around his eyes. The future king had been dealing with his own challenges, balancing his role as heir with his duties as a husband and father. Before William could speak, Camilla placed Tom's letter on the desk between them. She watched as the future king read through the demands, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked up at her with a mixture of disappointment and concern that cut through her heart like a knife. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, the grounds of Windsor Castle continued their daily routine. Gardeners tending to the roses, guards changing shifts, tourists gathering at the gates hoping for a glimpse of royal life. But inside this study, two of the most important figures in the British monarchy were grappling with a crisis that could change everything. William finally spoke, his voice measured but cold. He expressed his disappointment not just with Tom's demands, but with what he saw as a fundamental misunderstanding of how the monarchy worked. The royal family, he explained, was not a democracy where positions could be claimed or demanded. It was an institution built on centuries of tradition, law, and constitutional principle. Camilla tried to explain Tom's perspective, describing the years of feeling like an outsider looking in at royal life. She spoke of her son's frustration at being close enough to touch the world of royalty, but never truly being part of it. She mentioned the awkward position Tom found himself in at royal events. Neither a full member of the family nor a complete outsider. But William's response was swift and decisive. He reminded Camilla that Tom had chosen his own path in life, pursuing a career in food writing and criticism. He had never expressed interest in royal duties before, and his sudden demand seemed opportunistic rather than genuine. William questioned whether Tom truly understood the sacrifices and responsibilities that came with royal titles. The conversation grew more heated as they discussed the implications of Tom's demands. William pointed out that granting special privileges to Tom would set a dangerous precedent. Other relatives of royal spouses might make similar demands, potentially diluting the monarchy's focus and creating endless complications about who deserved what position. Camilla found herself caught between her love for her son and her loyalty to the institution she now represented. She understood William's concerns, but she also felt a mother's instinct to protect and support her child. The conflict was tearing her apart, and she struggled to find a solution that would satisfy both sides. As their discussion continued, William revealed that he had already spoken with King Charles about the situation. The king was deeply troubled by Tom's demands and felt that immediate action was necessary to prevent the situation from escalating further. William suggested that a family meeting be called to address the issue directly and firmly. Camilla's heart sank at the thought of confronting Tom in front of the entire royal family. She knew her son could be stubborn when he felt wronged, and she feared that a direct confrontation might push him to take more drastic action. But William was insistent that the matter needed to be resolved quickly and decisively. The study fell silent again as both Camilla and William contemplated the difficult decisions ahead. The monarchy had faced many challenges throughout history, but family disputes were often the most dangerous because they attacked the institution from within. They both knew that how they handled this crisis would have lasting implications for the royal family's unity and the public's perception of their stability. William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where tourists continued to gather, unaware of the drama unfolding inside the castle walls. He spoke about the responsibility they all carried to preserve the monarchy for future generations. Every decision they made, he reminded Camilla, would affect not just their own lives, but the lives of their children and grandchildren. Camilla listened to William's words and felt the full weight of her position as queen consort. She had never sought this role, but now that she held it, she understood the enormous responsibility that came with it. The monarchy was bigger than any individual, including her own son. But finding a way to honor the responsibility while still being a loving mother would be one of the greatest challenges of her life. As the meeting concluded, William made it clear that he expected a swift resolution to the situation. He could not allow Tom's demands to create uncertainty about the succession or the stability of the royal family. The future king's message was unmistakable. Family loyalty could not come at the expense of constitutional order. Camilla left William's study with a heavy heart and an even heavier burden. She had to find a way to convince Tom to withdraw his demands without destroying their relationship. She also had to maintain her standing within the royal family while navigating what was becoming an increasingly complex and emotionally charged situation. The palace corridors that had felt so familiar now seemed foreign and intimidating. Every servant and staff member she passed seemed to look at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Word of the crisis was clearly spreading, despite attempts to keep it contained. Camilla realized that time was running out to find a quiet resolution to the matter. Back in her chambers, she sat down to compose a response to Tom's letter. Every word had to be chosen carefully, balancing her role as a mother with her responsibilities as queen consort. She needed to convey the seriousness of the situation while still leaving room for reconciliation. The future of her family relationships, and possibly the monarchy itself, hung in the balance as she began to write. 3 days had passed since Camilla's tense meeting with William, and the atmosphere at Buckingham Palace had grown increasingly strained. Staff members moved through the corridors with unusual urgency, and there was an unmistakable tension in the air that even the most experienced royal employees found unsettling. The queen consort had spent countless hours trying to craft the perfect response to her son's demands, but every draft felt inadequate for the magnitude of the situation. Tom Parker Bowles had not remained idle during these 3 days. Unknown to his mother, he had been consulting with legal advisors and constitutional experts, building what he believed was a solid case for his claims. He had researched historical precedents where royal spouses' children had been granted titles and positions within the monarchy. His confidence was growing with each passing day, and he interpreted his mother's delayed response as a sign that she was seriously considering his demands. The situation became even more complicated when Tom decided to reach out to other members of the extended royal family. He sent carefully worded letters to several distant relatives, testing the waters to see if others shared his frustrations with their positions within the monarchy's hierarchy. These letters, while diplomatic in tone, essentially asked whether others would support his bid for formal recognition and enhanced status. Camilla was horrified when she learned of Tom's expanded campaign from her private secretary. What had started as a family dispute was now threatening to become a broader challenge to the established order. She realized that her son had seriously underestimated the potential consequences of his actions and was proceeding down a path that could lead to his complete exclusion from royal circles. Meanwhile, Prince William had been conducting his own consultations. He met privately with constitutional lawyers, palace advisors, and even reached out to former prime ministers to understand the full implications of Tom's demands. Every expert he consulted delivered the same message. Granting Tom's requests would require parliamentary approval and could open the door to countless similar claims from other royal relatives. The future king also spoke with his father, King Charles, who was deeply troubled by his stepson's actions. Charles had always tried to maintain a cordial relationship with Camilla's children, but he felt that Tom's current behavior was both inappropriate and potentially damaging to the monarchy. The king was particularly concerned about how the situation would appear to the public if it became known. William's investigation revealed that Tom's legal research, while extensive, was fundamentally flawed. The historical precedents he had cited were either from different constitutional periods or involved very different circumstances. Modern constitutional law was clear about the line of succession and the process for granting royal titles. Tom's demands simply had no legal foundation in contemporary British law. Armed with this information, William requested another meeting with Camilla. This time, however, he was accompanied by the palace's senior constitutional advisor and the Queen's private secretary. The meeting took place in the formal throne room, a deliberate choice to underscore the seriousness of the situation and the constitutional issues at stake. Camilla arrived at the meeting feeling isolated and overwhelmed. She had been unable to reach Tom for 2 days, as he had been avoiding her calls while he continued his consultations with various advisors. She was beginning to understand that her son had moved far beyond simple demands and was now actively challenging the fundamental structure of the monarchy. William began the meeting by presenting the constitutional advisor's findings. The legal position was unambiguous. Tom's demands could not be granted without parliamentary legislation, and there was absolutely no political will to pursue such legislation. In fact, any government that attempted to alter the succession laws for personal requests would likely face significant public and political opposition. The constitutional advisor explained that the monarchy's stability depended on its adherence to established law and tradition. Granting special privileges to Tom would not only set a dangerous precedent, but could also raise questions about the royal family's commitment to constitutional principles. The advisor painted a stark picture of the potential consequences, including possible calls for broader constitutional reform or even Republican movements gaining strength. Camilla listened to these explanations with growing despair. She began to understand that her son's demands were not just inappropriate, but potentially destructive to the very institution she now represented. The weight of her dual loyalty to family and crown was becoming unbearable, and she struggled to find any path forward that would preserve both relationships. William then revealed that palace staff had been monitoring media attention, and there were signs that rumors about internal royal family tensions were beginning to circulate. Several tabloid journalists had been asking pointed questions about Tom's recent activities, and it was only a matter of time before the story broke into public view. The future king stressed that they needed to resolve the situation immediately before it became a public relations disaster. The conversation turned to potential solutions, but the options were limited and unsatisfactory. William suggested that Tom be given a final ultimatum to withdraw his demands voluntarily. If he refused, he would be permanently excluded from all royal events and functions. The family would also consider releasing a public statement distancing themselves from his claims. Camilla found this proposed solution devastating. The idea of publicly rejecting her own son went against every maternal instinct she possessed. She pleaded with William to consider alternative approaches, perhaps offering Tom some form of honorary position that would satisfy his desires without threatening the constitutional order. But William's response was firm and uncompromising. He explained that any compromise would be seen as weakness and would encourage others to make similar demands. The monarchy could not afford to appear uncertain or divided, especially during a time when its relevance and value were already being questioned by some segments of society. The meeting grew increasingly tense as Camilla struggled to accept the harsh reality of her situation. She had hoped that her position as queen consort would allow her to bridge the gap between her family and the royal institution, but instead, she found herself forced to choose between them. The pain of this realization was evident in her voice as she spoke about her love for her son and her fear of losing him forever. William, despite his firm stance, showed some sympathy for Camilla's position. He acknowledged that the situation was unfair to her personally, but he emphasized that the monarchy's survival depended on difficult decisions being made when necessary. He reminded her that throughout history, royal family members have been forced to sacrifice personal relationships for the greater good of the institution. The constitutional advisor added that modern monarchies that had survived and thrived were those that had maintained clear boundaries and consistent principles. Countries where royal families had bent rules or made exceptions had often faced greater instability and public criticism. The British monarchy's strength lay in its predictability and adherence to constitutional norms. As the meeting concluded, William presented Camilla with a draft letter that he wanted her to send to Tom. The letter was formal and direct, clearly explaining why his demands could not be met and outlining the consequences of continuing his current course of action. The tone was respectful but firm, designed to give Tom one final opportunity to step back from his demands gracefully. Camilla read through the draft letter with tears in her eyes. The language was precise and legally sound, but it felt cold and impersonal when directed at her own son. She asked for time to review the letter and possibly suggest modifications that might soften its tone while maintaining its essential message. William agreed to give her 24 hours to consider the letter, but he made it clear that this was the final extension he could offer. The situation had already gone on too long, and every additional day increased the risk of public exposure and constitutional damage. He stressed that Camilla's decision would be final and irreversible. After the meeting, Camilla returned to her private chambers feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The role of queen consort, which she had worked so hard to fulfill with dignity and grace, now felt like a prison that separated her from her son. She understood the constitutional necessities that William had outlined, but accepting them emotionally was far more difficult. That evening, Camilla finally, managed to reach Tom by phone. Their conversation was strained and emotional, with Tom expressing frustration at what he saw as his mother's abandonment of his cause. He accused her of being more loyal to her new family than to her biological children, a charge that cut deeply into her heart. Camilla tried to explain the constitutional realities and the potential consequences of his continued demands, but Tom remained convinced that the royal family was simply unwilling to share their privileges. He interpreted their resistance as personal rejection rather than institutional necessity, making the conversation even more difficult and painful. The phone call ended with harsh words on both sides, leaving Camilla devastated and more isolated than ever. She realized that the next day would likely mark the end of her close relationship with her son, regardless of how she chose to proceed. The crown that had once represented honor and duty now felt like a burden that was destroying her family from within. As night fell over the palace, Camilla sat alone with William's draft letter, knowing that her signature would change everything forever. The weight of history and the demands of the present had converged into an impossible choice that would define not only her reign as queen consort, but her relationship with her son for the rest of their lives. The following morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the atmosphere within palace walls. Camilla had barely slept, spending most of the night pacing her chambers and rehearsing conversations with her son that would never take place. By dawn, she had made her decision, though it felt like choosing between her heart and her duty. The letter to Tom would be sent as William had drafted it, with only minor modifications to soften the harshest language. As Camilla's private secretary prepared to dispatch the letter, unexpected news arrived that would complicate an already dire situation. Tom had scheduled a meeting with a prominent journalist from the Times, one known for investigative pieces about the royal family. Palace intelligence suggested that Tom was planning to make his story public, presenting his case directly to the British people and potentially forcing the royal family's hand through media pressure. William received this information while he was reviewing official state papers in his office. The news hit him like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about how the situation might unfold. A public campaign by Tom would not only embarrass the royal family, but could also trigger broader constitutional debates about the monarchy's role and relevance in modern Britain. The future king immediately convened an emergency meeting with senior palace advisors and King Charles himself. The emergency meeting took place in the palace's secure conference room, a space typically reserved for matters of national security. King Charles arrived looking older than his years, the stress of recent events clearly weighing heavily on him. He had hoped that the situation could be resolved quietly within the family, but Tom's decision to involve the media had elevated the crisis to a new level entirely. Palace communications specialists presented various scenarios for how the story might unfold once it became public. The most optimistic projections involved intense, but brief media attention followed by public sympathy for the royal family's position. However, the worst-case scenarios painted pictures of prolonged constitutional debates, Republican movements gaining momentum, and serious damage to the monarchy's reputation both domestically and internationally. William listened to these presentations with growing determination. He understood that decisive action was now essential to protect the institution he would one day lead. The future king announced that he would personally contact Tom before the journalist meeting, making one final attempt to convince him to abandon his public campaign. If that failed, the royal family would need to prepare for a very public confrontation. Meanwhile, Tom was meeting with his own advisors at his London home, finalizing his strategy for the upcoming interview. He had convinced himself that public opinion would support his cause once people understood his position. In his mind, he was fighting not just for his own recognition, but for other royal family members who had been marginalized by the institution's rigid hierarchy. Tom's advisors included a former parliamentary researcher who had helped him develop constitutional arguments, and a public relations specialist who believed the story could be framed as a David versus Goliath narrative. They encouraged Tom to present himself as someone seeking fairness and inclusion rather than privilege, and entitlement. The strategy was designed to generate sympathy and support from ordinary British citizens who might relate to feeling excluded from elite institutions. The call from William came just as Tom was reviewing his talking points for the interview. The conversation that followed would later be described by those who witnessed it as one of the most intense exchanges ever between members of the royal family. William's tone was formal, but carried an undercurrent of barely controlled anger as he explained the full implications of Tom's planned media appearance. William laid out the constitutional facts with clinical precision, explaining how Tom's public campaign could damage not just the royal family, but the entire constitutional framework of the United Kingdom. He described how other Commonwealth realms might view the controversy, potentially affecting relationships with countries where the British monarch served as head of state. The future king painted a picture of constitutional chaos that could result from Tom's actions. Tom's response was defiant and emotional. He accused William of caring more about protecting an outdated system than about family relationships. He argued that the monarchy's refusal to evolve and include people like him was exactly why the institution was becoming increasingly irrelevant to modern Britain. The conversation escalated quickly, with both men raising their voices and exchanging accusations that cut to the heart of their fundamental disagreement. The confrontation reached its climax when William delivered an ultimatum that shocked even the palace staff who were monitoring the call. He told Tom that if he proceeded with the media interview, he would be permanently banned from all royal properties and events. Furthermore, the royal family would publicly disavow his claims and make it clear that he spoke only for himself, not for any member of the royal family. Tom's reaction to this ultimatum was immediate and fierce. He accused William of being a tyrant who used threats and intimidation to maintain power. He declared that he would not be silenced or bullied into submission, and that the British people deserved to know the truth about how the royal family treated its extended members. The conversation ended with Tom hanging up the phone, leaving William listening to a dial tone and knowing that diplomatic solutions were no longer possible. Within hours of the failed phone call, both sides began preparing for public battle. The palace activated its crisis management protocols, briefing senior government officials and preparing statements to counter whatever claims Tom might make. A team of constitutional experts was assembled to provide media commentary supporting the royal family's position, while communication specialists worked on damage control strategies. Tom, meanwhile, moved forward with his planned interview, which was now scheduled to be published the following day. The journalist conducting the interview was known for thorough preparation and hard-hitting questions, but Tom felt confident in his ability to present his case effectively. He spent the evening before the interview reviewing documents and preparing for challenging questions about his motivations and expectations. The interview took place in Tom's home, with cameras capturing both his words and his emotions as he explained his grievances against the royal family. He spoke passionately about feeling like an outsider despite his mother's prominent position, describing years of awkward family gatherings where he never quite belonged. Tom presented his demands as reasonable requests for inclusion rather than attempts to disrupt constitutional order. The journalist pressed Tom on specific constitutional points, challenging his understanding of how the monarchy operated and questioning whether his demands were realistic given existing laws. Tom's responses revealed both his sincere belief in his cause and his fundamental misunderstanding of the legal and constitutional barriers to his requests. The interview captured a man genuinely convinced of the righteousness of his position, even as he demonstrated limited grasp of the broader implications. When asked about the royal family's response to his demands, Tom's anger became clearly visible. He described feeling abandoned by his mother and bullied by William, painting a picture of an institution that prioritized protocol over family relationships. His emotional responses during these portions of the interview would later become some of the most widely quoted and analyzed segments of the piece. The completed interview was scheduled for publication the next morning, but advance copies were provided to palace officials as a professional courtesy. When William read through Tom's statements that evening, he felt a mixture of anger, disappointment, and resignation. The die had been cast, and there was no returning to the private family dispute that the situation had once been. Camilla learned about the interview's content from her private secretary, who delivered the news with obvious reluctance. Reading through Tom's public criticisms of the royal family felt like receiving physical blows, each quote more painful than the last. Her son had not only rejected her position, but had publicly questioned her loyalty and integrity in ways that would be impossible to forget or forgive. That night, as the palace prepared for the storm that would break the following morning, Camilla sat alone in her private study, surrounded by family photographs that now seemed to mock her current situation. Pictures of happier times with Tom, images from royal events where he had seemed content with his role, and formal portraits from her wedding to King Charles all served as reminders of how dramatically everything had changed. The queen consort understood that the following day would mark a permanent transformation in her relationship with her son and possibly in her own role within the royal family. Tom's public challenge had forced her to choose sides definitively, and she had chosen the crown over her child. The weight of that choice would stay with her forever, but she knew that the alternative would have meant abandoning her duty and potentially destabilizing the entire constitutional system she had sworn to uphold. As midnight approached, final preparations were being made on both sides for the public battle that would begin with the sunrise. The palace had prepared comprehensive responses to Tom's expected claims, while Tom's supporters readied themselves to promote his story across social media and sympathetic news outlets. What had begun as a private family disagreement was about to become a very public test of the monarchy's stability and the strength of Britain's constitutional foundations.